Hello, in today's video we are going to be answering the question, how successfully did Elizabeth solve the problem of religion during her reign? Hopefully you will have watched the previous video which will assist you in understanding the Tudor religious roller coaster that had taken place leading to Elizabeth becoming Queen. Let's make it very clear though, Elizabeth was brought up a Protestant but had shown compassion towards Catholic elements of the religious service. She had shown a keen interest in the music and decoration of Catholic services, something which was against the Protestant ideas. Her attitude towards religion in Tudor England was an attempt to heal the divisions between Catholics and Protestants, to steer away from unrest and potential civil war. Elizabeth inherited a country that was divided on religion, and this divide can be seen geographically. There were regional power bases in England which supported Protestantism, traditionally the southeast of England, and Catholicism in the north and west country of England. This would be a daunting task for any monarch, who would also want to increase her crown's personal power and wealth. Ultimately, Elizabeth sought to project a mood of reconciliation between the two major Christian denominations in England, and is believed to have tried to find a middle way between these two religions. Today we will try and assess how successful Elizabeth was in creating this middle way. I would highly recommend for your notes to make sure that you have a copy of this diagram. The diagram shows Elizabeth's religious settlement, that she was trying to create laws that would appeal to the centre ground of Catholicism and Protestants. However, there were also extremists on either side of this religious argument. You have Jesuits, who were a radical Roman Catholic missionary priests. They trained abroad and would be sent to England and attempt to turn the country back to a Catholic state. At the other end of the spectrum, you have Puritans. They are radical extreme Protestants who try to remove all Catholic elements from church services and that the church needed further reform. If Elizabeth does manage to succeed to find the middle way, and a centre ground between the Catholics and Protestants, it would undoubtedly alienate those at the extremist ends. Make sure you have a copy of this spectrum of Christianity for your own notes. This will prove particularly important with future lessons to come. Our next task for the video is to decide, well, how middle was Elizabeth's middle way? I would like you to draw out the following graph. On the x-axis are the four main law changes to religion that took place during Elizabeth's reign. On the y-axis is our spectrum of the Christian faith. You will need to decide with the following elements of the video. Make sure you are happy with what the act is, and you would then need to place onto this graph whether you feel Elizabeth successfully manages to find a compromise between the Catholics and the Protestants, or in fact is more in favour with one side of the religion or not. By the end of this graph, you should have an overall impression of how successful Elizabeth was in finding this centre ground. Pause the video and make sure you have a copy of this graph. I would recommend that the graph doesn't need to be too big. It could be no more than 8 lines deep, but make sure you have annotations underneath the graph explaining your decision. This should include what the act is and which religious group would have been more happy with the outcome. The first act is the Act of Supremacy in 1559. It made the English monarch the head of the church instead of the Pope. Elizabeth chose the softer title of Supreme Governor instead of the Supreme Head of the Church that had been favoured by her father Henry. It also required all churchmen to swear an oath of loyalty to ensure the change of leadership was accepted. Make sure you have notes on what the Act of Supremacy is, and before continuing with the video, decide where it would place on our graph. Is this Elizabeth successfully finding the middle way? So, where did you place the Act of Supremacy on your graph? Whilst this isn't an accurate science, I personally believe we would see it more favouring the Protestants. The Catholics would have wanted the Pope as the head of the Church and not Elizabeth. The use of the Supreme Governor, whilst might have been a softening of the title, still does not overshadow the fact that Elizabeth is the head of the Church and not the Pope. The next law was the Act of Uniformity, passed in 1559. The terms included that any church practices which existed in Edward's reign should still be followed, and I think it's worth mentioning the Protestant Edward. The Protestant communion table would be kept, but Catholic ornaments such as crosses and candles could be placed on the table. Priests also had to wear the traditional Catholic style vestments. Vestments were the clothing that they would wear, seen opposite. A new prayer book was issued, which was moderately worded, but contained some radical Protestant ideas. And the Bible was written in English, services were held in English, and the clergy were allowed to marry. Where would you place the Act of Uniformity on Elizabeth's attempts to gain the middle way? So, where did you place the Act of Uniformity? Again, this isn't an accurate science, but for me personally, I placed it still favouring the Protestants, but had some concessions to the Catholics. While some of the decorations and structures of the services were Catholic, most of the religious decisions were still favouring the Protestants. In 1563, Elizabeth passed the law of the 39 Articles. This was a new set of terms that would define the practice of the Church of England. The original ideas of this were for there to be 42 of them, based on the Protestant Thomas Cranmer's ideas, although these were eventually reduced. Now, we don't need to know all 39 articles, but special attention should be given to the ambiguous, unclear stance on the Catholic idea of transubstantiation. According to the 39 articles, there was a spiritual presence of Christ's body and blood in communion. It aimed at uniting Protestants, as most of the articles were based on ideas from Edward's reign. Again, where would you place the 39 articles in Elizabeth's attempt to find the middle way? So, where did you place the 39 articles? Well, for me, again, it was favouring the Protestants. Whilst the ambiguous element of transubstantiation, the idea that the bread and wine transform into the body and blood of Christ, was a Catholic idea, most of the articles were still in keeping with Edward's Protestant reforms. A mild victory for the Catholics in what was becoming a very unlikely middle way. The final law coincides with an order given by Pope Pius V, which was known as a Papal Bull, not to be confused with the image to the right. In 1570, Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth from the Catholic Church for placing herself as the head of the Church in England. She was declared a heretic, and the Pope encouraged all Catholics to rise up and overthrow her. In response to this, Elizabeth passed the Treason Act in 1571. Anyone who denied Elizabeth as the head of the Church or acted on the Pope's instruction could be punished by death. Also, anyone who left the country for more than 6 months had their land confiscated. It was believed that those gone for longer than this time were going abroad to train as Catholic missionaries. Where does the Treason Act lie in Elizabeth's middle way? I think it's fair to say that the Treason Act is the final nail in the Catholic coffin. It is suggesting that anyone who disobeys the Protestant idea of Elizabeth as the head of the Church could be punished by death. And this is a major turning point in the relationship between Catholics in England and Catholics abroad, as we will see in future lessons. As we can see from this spread, Elizabeth's middle way is very much not what was presented in the actions of the law. So what are our final thoughts on Elizabeth and her religious changes? Elizabeth attempted to give the impression of the middle way, but the vast majority of the services and doctrines were based on a broadly Protestant idea. Her means to create a compromise angered extremists at both ends of the spectrum. Puritans would be unhappy with the Catholic elements, and radical Catholics would feel inclined to support the words of the Pope in the excommunication of Elizabeth. Ultimately, further problems with Puritans and Catholics were sadly inevitable for Elizabeth. Thanks for watching today. I hope you found the information of great value. Keep up the great work.